right, welcome back to Core 1929, Methods of Inquiry, Health and Well-Being. We are going to today take you beyond, we've been going through each of our individual disciplines, and you've been getting a flavor for how our individual disciplines sort of deal with the issue of the COVID-19 pandemic. But what we're going to do today is try to show you how each of our individual disciplines sort of comes together to try to analyze one aspect of how we manage that pandemic. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at some objects that you probably take for granted in your everyday life, but you probably see them if you've been around campus, or even if you've just sort of been walking around where you live. You've been seeing maybe posters that give you information about health behaviors you might follow during COVID-19. And what we want to do is sort of from each of our disciplinary perspectives, talk about how we would interpret what this poster is doing, how language is working, how it's incorporating health information, or from my side, how it deals with some of the collective action problems inherent in the pandemic. So we're going to walk through some of these posters, and this should give you a sense of what you'll be doing when you do the presentation assignment later in the week. You will be actually sort of doing your own sort of analysis of these different kinds of posters from different disciplinary perspectives. I'll note this will be a short lecture, and at the end of the lecture there'll be a very short and I think easy 3-question quiz that you can complete on D2L. So without further ado, let's take a look at our first poster. And this comes to us from Catholic University of America. And as you can see, the poster here says, respect, protect, take care of our university community. We've got some pictures of students wearing their masks. On the left-hand bottom corner, we've got someone washing their hands with lots of soap and water. We've got people standing apart from one another, social distancing. And we've got a woman covering her nose and mouth when she is sneezing or coughing. And we've got some little COVID-19 images there. Now, I think what's really interesting from my perspective, in my lecture, we talked about COVID-19 as a collective, right? And one of the sort of challenges that we face when we're acting collectively is thinking about what our role is, how pivotal we might be in actually shaping the outcome. And in large groups, it might feel like us taking healthy behaviors, us washing our hands, wearing a mask, or social distancing might not have that big of an effect, right? And one of the reasons that is when we think about collective action, when we talk about COVID, it's usually happening on such a large scale that you really do feel insignificant. And I think what this poster does that's sort of interesting from my perspective is it sort of bounds that problem a little bit, right? It doesn't say your actions will have this effect in the world writ large, but your actions will have this effect on our university community. And the sort of assumption that the poster is making is that people identify with that community. So it might affect how people perceive the P in the equation, B times P minus C plus D. But it also might affect how people perceive their duty, right? If we assume that people have some sort of connection or identify strongly with the university that they are going to, that might be really impactful. I think, if I were to make this a little bit more impactful, I might try to, use some university mottos or mascots even to try to sort of emphasize that. Anything that just signals university identity, something that people connect with, I think might actually even enhance what they're trying to do with this poster, which is make it easier for people to see the potential impact of their actions. What did you think, Brittany?
So I'll pick it up from here. So as the kind of English person on this trio, the thing that I am always looking at is the way that language happens in these modes of communication. So both visual language, but then also the actual words on the poster. And here there's a bunch of really interesting visual language, but what I'm most interested in are those two initial words, respect and protect. So in the rest of this lecture, both myself and Dr. Rocco are going to talk a decent amount about causality, i.e. why things happen. And one thing that is interesting from an English perspective to note is that in language, causality follows word order, or causality follows order. So as English readers, generally, if we see one thing come before another, something that our brains will do is assume that that first thing somehow explains or causally leads to that second thing, even though that is actually a logical fallacy. So that isn't necessarily true, but it's something that our brains do really easily. When we look at this poster, what our brains do when we read the word respect and then protect is that we assume that there is some kind of causal relationship between those two things. And I think that that's really interesting here. So let's look at those two words a bit more closely. So what is respect doing here and what is protect doing? Well, respect is a term that we usually use for navigating social networks. It's a term associated with decorum, sometimes hierarchies. Respect is something that we feel is due in certain circumstances. And because the order here is implicitly causal, what this poster is essentially saying is we protect because we respect. So respect is the bigger and more encompassing category. And I think that that's really interesting because a question that I would ask you to ask is what is being respected here? It isn't other people's lives because that's the object, the grammatical object of protect. We protect other people's lives. So what is the grammatical object of respect? Well, it's much more difficult to say and much more amorphous. And what I would guess that the object is because we respect our community or we respect the roles of our community, the kind of rules of our community. Therefore, we protect life within our community. So the kind of upshot here, the causal upshot, is that respect protect order is implying that the reason that we should wear masks and protect each other is because it's the respectful thing to do. And that's actually rather a different thing from it being the ethical thing to do. It privileges social and cultural mores, the kind of rules of society, over the idea that we should protect life as our first principle. And one way to kind of think about this is to flip the order of respect and protect. So how would this poster read if it said protect, respect? Then the argument would be because we protect, we respect, i.e. because we protect life, because that is our goal, therefore we respect the order to wear masks. And that is implied by the kind of visual language of all of the people in masks next to this poster. So the kind of upshot here, or what I think is most interesting, is that this is a poster that is saying we don't necessarily protect life as the first principle. We protect life because it is part of the rules of respect that govern our community. So Jerry, what would you think about this?
I look at this from a very different perspective, obviously. I'm looking at this from a science perspective, and if somebody walked by this, would this actually tell them anything? And so when I'm looking at this poster to me is something that could maybe only begun to be used recently. This wouldn't be a poster that would be logical to put up and expect this to teach anybody anything. This poster assumes that they already know that they're supposed to social distance. So, and what is the end goal of this poster? Are we supposed to walk just by it and it's a reminder, or is it supposed to teach us something? So, in my profession, it's about motivating people to do the right thing. And so for this poster, I would not consider this a very motivational poster to get people to do what they should do. It's just too visual, and you have to assume that they already know what this stuff means.
Yeah, I like the point. It's a reminder more than it is an instructional device. You're assuming by this point that what people need is they need to be reaffirmed in their beliefs, and I think that's a fair critique. But I think if it's all about reaffirmation and connecting this to identity, I wonder if that might be more helpful in that situation. But again, I think it's the audience. The audience for this poster also isn't necessarily entirely clear, right?
Correct.
Yeah, it suggests that it's the university community, but that's a very big body and quite amorphous. And again, kind of the idea that this is both like this is an in-group communication speaking to people who presumably already know those rules is why kind of respect is first. And I think that it is doing that sort of interesting social work of reaffirming something that it doesn't necessarily that clearly establish, and whose audience, the community, is really broad here. Yeah. So do you guys want to move on to the next one?
Yeah, let's move on.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. So I'll start off with this one. So this is a really, really simple poster, and you can see that there is a simplistic visual of a mask, and then at the bottom, if you guys don't recognize that, that little keystone picture is a signature that represents Pennsylvania. So this is from a particular state, although that isn't especially visually clear if you don't know that Pennsy is the keystone state.
Mhm.
So I want to start off again by talking about word order, and I want to introduce you guys to a term that you can use to talk to potential nerdy dates. So this is a, please actually don't do this. This is this is a syllogism. So a syllogism is a logical sentence, or it's a kind of logical formulation that you usually hear of constructed as this: if A, then B. And I want to talk about this poster as making an implicit syllogistic case. So it is making an implicit logical case based, again, on the order of these two phrases: my mask protects you, your mask protects me. And I really like the syllogism that this poster is suggesting. And here is why. Um, so this mask's implicit syllogistic formulation, so if A, then B, is if my mask protects you, then your mask protects me. And so what it does here is suggest, i.e., if I am willing to protect you, so if I'm the first person who puts on my mask, you should also be willing to protect me. So it puts the I, the kind of audience perspective. And I want a kind of important English concept that I want you guys to think about here with these posters is that the posters have an audience, but they also have an audience stand-in. So every poster is imagining that you, the viewer, will place yourself somewhere within it and identify with some aspect of its message and see yourself somewhere within that message. So here, the I is clearly the my, right? So my mask protects you. The poster wants us to see ourselves as the my. And what this poster then is implying is that it is our goal and responsibility to protect others first, even if they don't follow through. And so in syllogisms, if A, then B, B will only happen if A already does happen, but A does not depend on B. A can happen and then B can go like screw off if it wants to. Um, so here, what that suggests is that my mask protects you is the A in this formulation. So it is our job to protect other people, even if they don't, even if your mask doesn't end up protecting me. So it places social responsibility on the viewer. And to kind of let you think about this in a different way, I would encourage you to imagine what this poster's message would be if you flipped it. So your mask protects me, my mask protects you. The syllogism would then be working the other way, and it would actually read as almost a kind of threat.
Mhm.
Only if your mask protects me, only if you mask up will I mask up. So it essentially holds everybody else in the world hostage to, I will only be bothered to protect you if you have already done the work of protecting me. And I like that this poster actually encourages us to take the first step to protecting others. Phil, you can go on to I'll give this over to you now, because I think pro-social framing is the way that poli-science would talk about this.
Yes, and I want to remind or call everybody's attention back to that MIT Harvard experiment we talked about in my lecture, which varied the kind of posters that people saw. And you might remember that the language on the pro-social, right, the poster that's about protecting other people by wearing a mask, the way that it framed that was, by wearing a mask, you stop the spread to other people. Now, the problem with that, right, and one reason why we might have seen a minimized effect there is sometimes it's hard to figure out in that poster, who exactly are these other people, right? It's a very amorphous glob of other human beings, right? And what this framing does, because it's similarly pro-social, right, but it actually makes the framing relational. Rather than thinking about just yourself, your behavior, and how it will have some generic impact on the world, it draws it down to a very clear memory you might have had in which you were thinking about somebody maybe that you knew, somebody that you cared about. Or I was thinking about when I was walking down the street this morning, I had my mask on, and there was an older woman on the street and, waiting for me to pass by in a narrow passageway, but was clearly concerned about keeping our distance. And I thought really important that we both have our masks on in that situation. And I felt a great deal of empathy. But what this poster does is it takes that very problematic thing in collective action, which is how do my actions contribute to health in the world, and it reduces down to a one-to-one relationship, which is why I think you could see this poster as effective. Now, the one thing that the poster doesn't do, and we might see that as it could be a good thing or a bad thing, is it doesn't really deal with the question of messenger. There's an assumption being made here that you're seeing this poster, you're going to understand and trust that the message is right. And one thing that we know is that there is motivated reasoning. There is, a certain level of distrust of these kinds of messages and misinformation. And, that means that this poster might not work for everybody, right? And depending on what we're trying to do, this poster might not convince somebody who's, through motivated reasoning, inclined to disbelieve the effectiveness of masking. But it does exactly what Dr. Bobrill said earlier. It is a reminder, but in this case, I think it's a far more powerful one. What did you think about this one, Jerry?
I actually completely agree with everything that you said. And when I'm looking at this is assuming that people believe in masks.
Mm-hmm.
And we know right now, in fact, the order was extended now in the state of Wisconsin by Governor Evers yesterday to the end of November, that this is very, very controversial right now. Our state has the highest numbers of cases right now, and they're contributing it to people not wearing a mask. So this is a great a great poster, in my opinion, for people who believe in this. But the science behind it is not examined at all. So we're assuming that everybody does that. The poster we talked about before with the respect and protect, there has to be buy-in for really probably any of these posters to work. So, what kind of impact is this going to make? I think visually this is great. This could be on the wall, on the door of a Walmart or the door of a Target, and people would be, oh yeah, that's why I'm doing this, if they understand that this is important.
I saw a poster just like this at Marquette in the parking garage the other day. So
that's good.
We're using this messaging too. I think it's pretty effective.
Yep.
Excellent. So should we head to the next slide?
Yeah, let's move to the next one.
Okay.
Okay, so this is kind of complicated one. We have a sort of faceless man at the bottom, and with a mask on, and we have a sort of gloomy miasma cloud above him, with the listing of worldwide cases and deaths in the United States, and counting ellipsis, wear your mask. I don't like this poster at all from my perspective. And if you've been following along what I've been saying with the other two posters, you're going to already know the reason why, which is we have all of this data, which is important data. It's important to think about the scale, right? We're now over 200,000 deaths in the United States. So this is outdated. This is probably back in June or July. But what this does is I think it reinforces maybe how insignificant people might feel in wearing their mask, right? Here's this global pandemic, right? Millions of cases, hundreds of thousands of deaths, right? What is me wearing my mask going to do about that? That might be a way that somebody would read this, right? And I think that actually does, if you're messaging to people and what you're telling them is, yeah, there's this huge, big problem. You do your individual part. It makes collective action, I think, far harder, right? So much more powerful to say, you do this, somebody else, one other person, perhaps somebody that they're going to be protected, right? So it completely increases people's sense of pivotality, or even the community thing, right? In the case of Catholic U, it's like, you do this, and our community as a university will be protected. This completely undermines that. So yeah, I loathe this one.
I actually don't like it either, Dr. Rocco. I think that the data on it is not appealing at all. It's not something that would catch my eye at all. And this also plays into the anti-masker view that we have going on right now, especially in Wisconsin. This needs to continually be updated for it to make an impact.
Yes.
Which a poster like this would, be up there and in 2 weeks it'd be completely different, which is what we're seeing right now. I do think that there could be a place to use something like this if perhaps social media was sending out a reminder and it was on the side of your Facebook page with up-to-date numbers. There might be a little bit of a use for something like that, because I think a lot of people are so over even tracking what's going on. It's like COVID doesn't exist, that constant reminder of the numbers changing might help. But, it would have to be placed in a good spot. Generally, though, I think this is just not something that we should be hanging on a wall.
Yeah, I agree with everything you've both said. This poster does not seem rhetorically convincing, and its assumption seems to be that numbers by themselves are going to do the work. And I don't think we can count on numbers doing the work, especially as Jerry said, like, we can't count on the numbers doing the work if the numbers are constantly being updated, and this poster is now several months out of date. And I think that this poster's assumption that big scary counts are enough to motivate people to individual action, to go back to what Phil was saying, is a flawed one, because there is no kind of causal link between all of these posters and the act of wearing a mask. It almost looks as if the person wearing the mask here is like dreaming of all of these deaths, which doesn't actually give a good reason for wearing the mask. It just suggests that these deaths are going to happen anyway. Also the kind of visual positioning of the poster is significant, because you have this miasma of stuff that is literally pressing down on the head of the person, as if these numbers are going to crush the mask wearer. So it just really isn't a rhetorically convincing poster.
If I were gonna use numbers at all, the numbers I would use would be tailored to where the person is, right? How many people in your community, try to heighten that information. But I think in this case, it really does come down as a sort of crushing thing that that you as an individual can't necessarily control. So,
yeah, I would also date stamp the numbers,
yes.
because BT dubs, this was in June, May. So yeah. Anything else?
Oh, I'm sorry. That's assuming that a person even cares. Like, do they even care that people are dying? And we know that there's a lot of people out there that are stating that they don't care daily. So, it's just not a great poster. It's not something that I would ever stop and read. That's for sure.
Yeah. So I'll pop us over to the next one then.
All right. And I'll start off with this one. This is this poster for somebody who has a scientific mind. And they are looking at, data. Does it work? Does it not work? This is a snapshot of somebody sneezing without a mask, with a mask, just one person, and then with 2 masks. Now, again, I think that this would catch people's eye if they were seeking information about, do the masks work? I don't know that if this was hanging up on a wall, that they just walk right past it. So that's my big concern with this. And, we have so many controversial things. Every week something's changing. We had the CDC announce on Friday night that this is, airborne, and it can float, now they're saying 12 feet without a mask. And then on Monday, for whatever reason, it was retracted. So we're living in a state right now that people are very confused. They don't know what they should do and what they shouldn't. We all know that we should be wearing a mask, though. So this would just be more of a reinforcement as to why, that's why I'm wearing my mask, a visual. I get it now.
I was sort of thinking about this in terms of one of the problems of thinking about risk, right? So one reason why people might not take health behaviors is they misperceive the risk, right? Smokers might misperceive the risk of smoking or underweight the risk of smoking to their health, right? And we know this sort of motivated reasoning. One thing about COVID is it's invisible, right? And so it's sort of hard to see how impactful your masking might be on transmission of particles. This at least deals with where you can see particle transmission. The problem is there might still be, and I think that there are people who disbelieve what's going on in that transmission of particles and whether or not those risks in here. But at the very least, if you're concerned about, what does this actually do? It doesn't feel like it does that much. You can see that literally it does prevent the exchange of these particles. So at least visually it does that.
Yeah, and to kind of pick up on that, I think that the end message of this poster is really interesting because it speaks back to the problem of to what extent can a poster educate as well as try to motivate. So now do you get it? That message implies that some kind of information about transmission is being communicated here. And as Phil noted, that's true of some things, but not necessarily of what's going on, in that cloud of white gas that these two people are sharing. And what is interesting about that final question, now do you get it, is that it does heavily imply that the problem of mask noncompliance, as it were, is that people don't understand the risks. And as Jerry had pointed out about in the last slide, that isn't necessarily the reason that people aren't wearing masks, that lack of understanding. One thing that I do like about the poster, though, is that it invites viewers to see themselves as both the person taking responsibility and as the person being endangered by a lack of responsibility. So because the poster is so kind of equal on both sides, I think viewers are invited to see themselves as either the person wearing the mask or the person in that second section being exposed without wearing the mask. And I think that that's actually really, really nice. So you can be both responsible and irresponsible at once.
Yeah.
All right. Move on to the next one.
Sort of similar one here too.
Yeah. This is very similar, but I think does a better job than the previous poster.
Yeah.
It shows, some of the aerosol, and it is giving us a visual of a warning system like a stoplight, which I find is eye-catching because of the color. And people who are interested in understanding this would actually gain some very valuable information from it. The most important one, I believe, is the one on the bottom where there's no risk, where it's actually giving a visual of social distancing, wearing a mask. Hand washing isn't on there, but that gives you an idea of, why the grocery stores are having one-way aisles. This is why. We know that if you are not looking at each other, you're minimizing your risk as well. If you're 6 feet away, right now we're a little bit concerned because they say the particles, the aerosol is lingering in the air, but this will really help to, if you're keeping your distance apart. The guidelines that we have out here are focusing on percentages on this poster, and that concerns me just a little bit because people generally, from a health perspective, ignore numbers, just like we talked about that the poster way back. They ignore numbers, but due to the colors, I think this would catch somebody's eye and maybe make an impact. I would hope.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is, again, I think one theme in these posters we've seen is there are always assumptions being made about audience. And this too seems to assume an audience that might need to be reminded about risk. But one thing I think is interesting is with masks, at the very least, it's now become so much more visible that people are wearing them. You turn on television, you see people wearing masks in public. The thing that I found interesting is I tried to find posters that were similar like this, but for hand washing. And I could not find them. And I think it's very interesting because it's a behavior that I think we take for granted now far more than masking, right? It's now just like it's sort of a visible thing. It's a meme. You go outside, you're not wearing a mask, you might even get a funny look, but no one sees you when you're not washing your hands. And I found it very interesting that we could not find a similar sort of thing detailing the risks of, not proper hand washing. It was very interesting.
Yeah, and just to piggyback a little bit about that, some general info. When you are in a microbiology class, whether it's for nursing or anything else, oftentimes than not, your instructor gives you, a little auger, and you go with a Q-tip and you go and swab areas that you normally are around, and then next time you come to your lab, they're growing all the nasty crap that we didn't see. There are posters out there that are actually just showing that. Honestly, the visual of that is very impactful the first time you see something like that because you've done it yourself. But
Yeah.
this doesn't, it's just a science
It's harder
thing
to communicate.
yeah. I mean, it works. That works because it's actually looking at you. What you touched is what is on your hands.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it strikes me too that like it would be difficult to put hand washing into the same kind of rhetorical frame as this poster because there isn't that kind of multiple steps of diminishing risk. It's did you wash your hands? Did you not wash your hands? And you have diminished the risk a significant amount by doing so. But it isn't. People don't see washing their hands as a social interaction in the same way that they see wearing masks as social interactions for precisely the reason that Phil had said earlier, because you usually don't have other people watching you wash your hands. So we
Right.
don't see it as a social activity, whereas mask wearing is, and you can have a poster that illustrates the amount of risk that you're posing directly to another person, and how that is diminished when you put the mask on. And it's just harder to do that with, I don't know, like a hand washing poster would have a picture of you touching a baby like three times. So it's harder to visually represent.
It's interesting. I never thought about it this way, but thinking back to the collective action equation, that D term, like one of the ways that we know that people begin to feel a heightened sense of duty to perform a collective action is peer pressure. So like one interesting thing about masks is if there's a critical density of people doing it on the street, conditional on you seeing that, you will feel more peer pressure to do it. And not everybody, of course, but a lot more people. With hand washing, because there is no visual, like maybe if you're in a bathroom with other people and people are washing their hands, you might feel more inclined to do it. But if you're sort of in the privacy of your own home or there's no one else in the bathroom, you might not. And so it's sort of an interesting thing. We think about mask wearing as something that's been difficult to get people to that level, but the visual component of it makes collective action a little bit easier than some other forms of activity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so my one very tiny quibble with this poster actually relates to that, because the image of the two green dudes social distancing, the poster's argument is not that they're social distancing because they ought to, it's because the one dude is trying to hawk the other some essential oils, which is funny, even though like if you all use essential oils, they smell good. It's great. Don't feel shamed about it.
Relaxing.
Yeah, they're lovely. But the poster, by adding that tiny little joke, kind of slightly obscures its message that the safest is social distancing with two people masks, because it suggests that one guy is running as far as he can away from essential oils person. And I also think the choice of essential oils is interesting because that's something that many people who might question health guidelines would associate with sort of hippy-dippy, worrying too much, woo-woo alternative medicine. And we do not want that kind of thing associated with mask wearing, because it implies that it is optional in the way that essential oils, although they're awesome, are more optional kind of medical things than, say, taking pills. But that's a small quibble in an otherwise well-composed poster.
Move on to the last poster we have, I think.
Okay. So, and I will start with this one just to make a couple of really blunt observations. So this is a poster from Minnesota. We see a very cute kind of chibi anime person with a little mask peering over a block of text with some interesting color fading happening, and then really neatly the message in 3 different languages. So I feel like the causal logic of this poster is pretty blunt. It just wear your mask so our businesses can stay open. It is just telling you that the reason that you should wear your mask, or one reason you should wear your mask, is because we don't want people. We want to keep businesses open. And so the point of view here, so the person that the audience of this poster is expected to inhabit is the consumer. And the implicit argument is that consumers are responsible for keeping businesses and implicitly because of that, the economy going. So what this poster does is put responsibility for the economic consequences of COVID onto individual decision makers, and in particular here, consumers, because it's your mask and our businesses. So it figures the you as the person walking into the store buying stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing about this poster from a sort of public health perspective is it does reorient the causal story that was being told in sort of the early days of the pandemic, which is public health measures like social distancing, mask wearing, other sorts of things, that those are going to be the things that prevent businesses from staying open, that are going to ruin the economy. So in other words, the initiating term was the pandemic, the middle term was public health protection, and the final consequences were economic collapse, right? This reorients it a lot, right? And it says the initiating conditions are the pandemic, the middle term is people not taking public health behaviors, and the final consequences. So it changes that middle term because the final consequence remains the same of sort of economic collapse or our business closes. From a public health perspective, I think that can be very helpful for people who might not be inclined to follow the public health messaging. From a policymaking perspective and how this all works, I think it can be a little bit misleading if we're trying to understand, because there are many different reasons why a business might not be able to stay open. For example, perhaps because they weren't using a bank that made it easy to get a PPP loan from the federal government in the early days of the pandemic, and those loans have run out, right? Or they didn't qualify for federal assistance that was out there, or simply there wasn't enough assistance, right? There are many different reasons in our political economy why businesses fail, and I would argue that most of the onus for that falls on the parts of the political economy like the Federal Reserve and Congress, who have really had a much more limited fiscal policy than they should have during the pandemic. So from a public health perspective, I think this makes a lot of sense. It reorients the causal story, but if we're trying to actually get people to understand, it might leave people with the sense that it's only them, like they, the individuals, that are contributing to these outcomes, when we know it's institutional too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when I look at this, I like the visual of it from, a health perspective. I'm a little bit concerned with the connection that people aren't understanding, that if we stay healthy, our economy will grow. If we're all sick, our economy is going to stay stagnant. We also have a lot of reasons now that are coming to light that early when Governor Evers' order was in place, that so many people fought it, that our government at the state level overturned his stay-at-home order. And what happened with that, when that started happening, very responsible businesses who would post this poster, who would put it up, continued to do curbside, continued to be closed. They didn't open up their bar. They were, did the best they could. But then we had other businesses, and I can name probably 5 off the top of my head, who said, screw all of it. We're opening. We don't care. You want to come in here, you want to sit down and drink till you fall off the bar, still go for it. Well, now we're seeing that a lot of those businesses are being boycotted. People were really in tune to that. They, especially when we look between Waukesha County and Milwaukee County. I live right on that line. And there are quite a few businesses now who opened when they shouldn't have, and they didn't respect what this poster said, that are now closing for those very reasons. So again, this comes back to the whole thing. Do you believe the science or do you not? And do you really understand that the economy is affected by this pandemic? And so people that believe it is are going to really like this poster and maybe possibly read it. But people who don't, or businesses who think it's BS, aren't even going to put it up.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
Right.
So I think that is it. So let's talk about a couple of the conclusions that we have gathered from looking at all of these posters together. And I would encourage you to, as you think about your own presentation assignment where you will be analyzing one of these posters, to try to think through these conclusions and draw out more of the sorts of analyses that we've been doing when you guys approach these posters yourselves. So just to start with English, the things that I would have you guys take away from the way that an English analyst would approach these posters is to think about syntax. So how is the information, both visual and linguistic information on the poster ordered, and how is that implicitly making an argument? So how does grammar lead to argumentation? And then secondly, POV, point of view. Who is the poster speaking to as the audience, but also who is the poster asking you to inhabit? So who are you supposed to identify with on the poster, and what does that tell you about what the poster wants you to take responsibility for? So we've seen some posters that ask us to inhabit the position of the kind of victim of not masking. And we have seen some posters that ask us to inhabit the position of the person who is protecting the people who are not masked. And I would venture to say that I slightly prefer the posters that are the ones that ask us to take on the responsibility of protecting others first. But the big takeaway here is point of view tells us something about how a poster is asking us to take responsibility, in the same way that syntax and causality tell us something about the explanation a poster is offering of its information.
Yeah, I would add to it from a political science perspective that when you're thinking about trying to get people to take public health behaviors, all of those behaviors are collective action, right? Which means you always have to deal with people's sense that their actions don't matter, that those actions are costly, and that they might not feel a duty to perform them in any way, right? Now, there's some general ways of dealing with that, but the key thing is not every audience is going to have the same variable starting points, right? They're not going to feel the same level of pivotality necessarily. They might experience different kinds of costs, and they might have different senses of duty to their community. So the first question with the poster is, who is this speaking to? Who are we trying to persuade, right? Talking to university students might be different than talking to people, in a school setting, in a K-12 setting. Talking to university students might be different than talking to people just sort of in the general community. But always begin with that, right? Because the causal stories that matter, and the causal stories need to mobilize to get people to feel like their actions matter, that they can bear the cost of collective action, and that they might have some sort of sense of duty to act collectively, all depend on what that audience's prior beliefs are, right? So if you're dealing with people that have no trust that any of what we've said today has any bearing on the world, you're going to need very different messages than the ones that we've been talking about, right? So there's some complications with that, but I think it all comes back to think about this as a problem of collective action and choose the stories that you think are going to resonate with things that people already believe, not necessarily what makes the most sense to you. I really liked the numbers poster because I'm a numbers guy, but I know that it's not going to work when we're trying to persuade people. So always be thinking about that who we're trying to persuade question.
Yeah, and from the health perspective, I look at all these a little bit differently than the other professors. I'm looking at, as a health nurse, which is part of my job, what is going to catch the eye of the viewer and what is going to make an impact on them to actually think about what we're trying to convey, what message we're trying to convey. So when I look at a poster, is it based on science? Is it just something that's, thrown out there? What motivates people? The first poster that we talked about, respect, that is very, very motivational if you are somebody who cares about respecting others. So it depends, just like Dr. Rocco said, it's what place are they coming from? So from my discipline, we're just trying to get people to look at the poster and think a little bit, not trying to teach them anything, just as they're more as reminders at this point in the pandemic than anything else. So that's what you should be looking at from the health perspective when you're doing your assignment.
Okay, so just to conclude here, we do have a couple of reminders for you guys. So there will be a quiz on this lecture, not very long. Each of us will write a question. That is going to be due October 1st at 5 p.m. Even more importantly, you have your first group presentation assignment, which will be due in your discussion section. So you'll be presenting during the discussion section, and you'll be working with your assigned groups. Your teaching assistants will give those to you. And then finally, the other thing to note is that you do have your first big written assignment, the annotation assignment, which is due October 2nd. at 5 p.m. And oh no, that's October 3rd because I can read and my discipline is about reading. October 3rd at 5 p.m. And you'll be uploading that to the D2L Dropbox. If you do have any questions about that, please do feel free to ask your teaching assistants or us. And otherwise than that, we hope that you enjoyed this lecture and that you enjoyed really digging into these posters, and we are looking forward to watching you all do the same in your presentation assignments. Thank you guys all so much, and we will see you in our next lecture.
Take care. See you soon.
Bye.